One of the traits that we all enjoy, especially in others, is loyalty. But you probably realize that loyalty has fallen on very hard times. People aren't very loyal anymore. Have you noticed? People switch jobs all the time. We aren't committed. We're not really loyal to institutions. People aren't even loyal to their marriages in many places in the world. But it's easy to say that about others, but what about you? Are you loyal? Would the people who know you best say, yes, you are definitely loyal? And if you say you're loyal, what evidence would you marshal to defend yourself? Would it be legitimate evidence? Do you show loyalty to others in your life? And more importantly, are you loyal to God? Do you show loyalty to the Lord? Are you committed to Him? And He would say of you, yes, truly, this is one of my choice servants, referring to you, that you're loyal. How does God motivate us to be loyal to Him? How does He help us to make sure that we have this kind of a commitment to Him that not only makes Him happy, but ultimately makes us fulfilled as well? Well, we are in our study of the prophets, and we have discovered that Israel wasn't very loyal for about 200 years. From the time of the division of the northern kingdom in 931 to the fall of that northern kingdom in 722, they weren't very loyal. And even with the southern nation that was judged in 586, they were not loyal. Prophets who were ministering at the same time after the earliest one of Obadiah, we have found to be Jonah and Amos. And now we're going to talk about Hosea. These three men were ministering within just a few years of one another, maybe 60, 70 years. And around that same time, we have other prophets like Isaiah and Micah, but we'll get to them soon enough. One of the things we see is that these prophets were raised up of God to tell the people, you're not really being loyal to Him. Jonah said that, Amos said that in different areas, and we are going to look at Hosea. If you just remember, they're not being loyal to Him, H-I-M, it'll help you remember which prophets were actually prophesying for the Lord at the fall of the northern kingdom. The H for Hosea, the I for Isaiah, and the M for Micah. H-I-M, Him. They didn't remember Him. And so therefore, the northern kingdom went into exile. But let's focus on the H. Let's focus on Hosea in relationship to loyalty. We saw that Jonah and Amos were respectively chiding the people and judging the people for their lack of evangelistic and social concern. And now when we get to Hosea, we're seeing the focus zero in on their spiritual life and their adultery, if you will. Spiritual adultery is what God calls worship of idols. God had been faithful to them, but they certainly were not faithful to the Lord. They certainly were not loyal to Him. So our key word for the book of Hosea is loyal. It appears several times in the book. They were people who maybe they would say that God was loyal to them, but they certainly didn't see any need for them to be loyal to God. And so we find the idolatry of Israel being depicted here. People who have all this wealth and prosperity, and yet the wealth and the prosperity did not seem to impact their lives and show forth in their lives a real loyalty to the one who'd been so loyal to them. It's sort of like the imagery here, of course, is marriage. It's The story of one spouse being very faithful to the other, but it's not reciprocated. And they had a long history of idolatry, and finally it was time to pay for their crimes against God. And so God raised up Hosea to be his messenger. This is a story of amazing love, to be honest. Hosea not only taught the message, he lived the message. He was the message. Because his marriage pictured God's so-called marriage to Israel. And we find this is an amazing story because it's an amazing story of restoration. The context, of course, is one of flagrant immorality. People all throughout Israel were not being faithful to their spouses, and they needed an example of someone who truly was faithful in the midst of an immoral culture. And so Hosea showed the opposite of that immorality by having an unrelenting commitment to his wayward wife. And what we will see in this book are two ways that God moves us to be loyal to him. So how does God motivate us to be loyal to him? He certainly wants us to be loyal to him. He certainly seeks to motivate us to do that. And so we're going to look at two ways he moves in our lives in order to help us to have that same commitment to him that he actually has to us. And our key word for the book is loyal. The book of Hosea can be summed up in this single word, loyalty. It is actually one word in the Hebrew called chesed that refers to covenant love that's shown by keeping promises. Okay, so when you think of loyalty, you think of this loyal word, think of covenant love. I've made a promise. I've made a covenant. In particular, the marriage covenant. And I'm loyal, I'm committed, I'm unrelenting to violate that covenant. And so the first way, really, that God shows us how we can be loyal here is God motivates loyalty by examples. We all need examples. And Israel certainly needed a great example of loyalty during the time of their spiritual adultery as well as their actual physical adultery. They were failing in both areas. And the Lord gives us illustrations of what it means to be committed because we need flesh and blood, practical people that we can relate to that will help us to see what loyalty really looks like. So Hosea showed amazing loyalty in his failed marriage. His wife didn't deserve his loyalty because she was unfaithful. But Hosea was an example of God's kind of loyalty. So let's see it as we get into the book itself. In this first chapter, we see that Hosea's wife Gomer bears 3 children before the Assyrian deportation. And they symbolize God's rejection of Israel, and yet God also promises a restoration due to his commitment to the Abrahamic covenant. So there's difficulty, but there's God's faithfulness throughout it. Hosea had a 45-year ministry. We see in the very first verse of this book that his ministry started in the time of Uzziah, and it went all the way to the time of Hezekiah. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaziah, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. There were others that followed as well beyond Jeroboam. This is a long, long ministry that God gave him. I hope the Lord will give me a 45-year ministry. I'm coming up on that now. I'm at 38 years now. But I would love to serve the Lord longer than that. So here's what we have in the second verse after we see the time in which this book takes place. When the Lord first began speaking to Israel through Hosea, he said to him, "Go and marry a prostitute." so that some of her children will be conceived in prostitution. This will illustrate how Israel has acted like a prostitute by turning against the Lord and worshiping other gods. Wow. Go take Gomer. Gomer's going to run off. She was not a bride who ran off because she actually had 3 children. And what about those children? While she's committing adultery, these children have some pretty strange names. It's debated about whether these children were actually Hosea's children or not. The text seems to indicate they were his children, even though she was committing adultery, because they are called his children. Did you ever think about the names of these children? His son is called Jezreel. Jezreel means he scatters, referring to God scattering. And it's referring back to 2 Kings 9:27. It's talking about God scattering the nation just like Jehu was used of God for his murder of Ahaziah and his relatives and how people scattered. What a strange name to give a son, you know? It's not like the son is going to be gathering people, but scattering them. And then he has a daughter, Lo Ruchama. No compassion. Seriously? Can you imagine Gomer calling her kids for meals? And she calls out, no compassion. Dinner's ready. Come out from playing. No compassion. I can imagine the people walking by on the street saying, did I just hear a mother refer to her daughter as no compassion? Seriously? Is that her daughter's name? I mean, aren't you supposed to name your daughter something really pretty? My wife's name is Susan. That means lily. Lilies are beautiful flowers. Most women's names are something like flower or fragrant or beautiful or something like that. But no compassion? God wanted to speak to his people through Gomer as well, and through Hosea. Every time they uttered their daughter's name, God wanted them to be his teaching means so that people around would say, why would people give such a name like that? Well, because God was going to harden his own heart and not have compassion on those people and send them into exile. And actually pretty soon, because Hosea lived during that time of the fall of the northern kingdom. And then the boy again, Lo Ami. Seriously? Not my people? Israel prided itself on being Ami, my people, where God would say, you are my people. But putting lo in front of it was to say the word no. No, not my people. And that would illustrate God's rejection of the northern nation of Israel. God saying, you certainly aren't living like my people, and I'm not going to care for you like my people. So those children had quite strange names, but they were illustrations actually of what God was going to do. And there's actually a future significance of what we have here in this first chapter or so of the book of Hosea. Despite God's discipline, God tells Hosea that he will eventually restore the nation in the following ways. He says in verses 10 and 11, even though he was going to reject them like the names of these children, yet the Israelites will be like the sand of the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader and will come out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say of your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one. There's going to be numerical, spiritual, national, civic, territorial, and divine blessings in all of this. God's a God of comfort, even in his judgment. And I believe that these promises have not been fulfilled yet. Texts like these show God makes these types of promises about a literal future kingdom where Israel will occupy the land in peace and experience God's blessings. If you don't believe in a millennium, you have to ignore these passages or say that they've already been fulfilled in history or are going to be fulfilled in the church. I really feel uncomfortable with those other options to say that the church has fulfilled this. He's really not talking about the church. He's talking about Israel here. Or to say that these have actually been fulfilled in the past, I would say, well, actually, when did that happen? Because I don't believe that hasn't happened yet. So God says, as we get into chapter 2, in that day you will call your brothers on me, my people. And you will call your sisters, Ruhama, the ones I love. God is going to do a good work. But it's not going to be without having to get Israel's attention by some severe discipline. So he says, but now, telling Hosea, but now bring charges against Israel, your mother. She's no longer my wife, and I'm no longer her husband. Tell her to remove the prostitute's makeup from her face and the clothing that exposes her breasts. Otherwise, I will strip her as naked as she was on the day she was born. I will leave her to die of thirst as in a dry and barren wilderness. Well, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it, in verse 2? She's no longer my wife and I'm no longer her husband. It almost sounds like Hosea divorced Gomer, calling her not my people and she's not my wife. Well, honestly, there are arguments for and arguments against this idea whether Hosea actually divorced Gomer. I have a one-page study on this in my notes, and I'll spare you the details, except to say that I would give a simple no to this answer. I don't think this is actually saying that he divorces her. It's actually saying that he is disciplining her and treating her as if she was no longer his wife. Because as we'll see in chapter 3, he actually brings her back. They don't get remarried. They just get restored. But in this particular time, he says, their mother is a shameless prostitute and became pregnant in a shameful way. She said, I'll run after other lovers and sell myself to them for food and water and clothing and wool and linen and for olive oil and drinks. But Hosea's response to them is where God says to him, therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. God does discipline her, but God brings her back. And what we find in this book is actually a very interesting depiction of how you could actually put the whole Old Testament together, focusing on the prophetic books. I like the chart from Walk Through the Bible that shows the various covenants that God had made with Israel. What we have here in this chart is the foundation of the Old Testament being the Pentateuch at the bottom. The basis of the prophetic message is Israel's covenant relationship with God. And the people of the covenant are on the upper left. The historical books talk about those covenant people who received the prophetic message. We've already addressed most of those. And in the upper right, you'll see the poetic books from Job to Song of Solomon, where the aim of the prophetic message is covenant behavior. This is how you're supposed to live. Right in the middle of all that are the prophets. The prophets were basically the covenant preachers to the covenant people, telling them to follow the covenant behavior based on their covenant relationship with God found in the Pentateuch. Does that make sense? And which covenant are we talking about? We're actually talking about two. We've already seen the Mosaic covenant amplified quite well in Deuteronomy 28 that shows that it is a conditional covenant. If Israel disobeys, there's going to be judgment. If Israel obeys, there's going to be blessing. But we understand, because Israel mostly disobeyed, they mostly experienced judgment. So that's the Mosaic covenant. But the prophets also talked much about the Abrahamic covenant. And you'll remember from Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 that this is an unconditional covenant where God promises that Israel will have the land, the seed, and the blessing, especially the blessing. And we understand that when the prophets are talking about Israel being covenant people, they're actually talking about both of these covenants. Sometimes they're actually talking about Israel under the Mosaic covenant. Other times they're talking about Israel as God's people as we look forward to the covenant given to Abraham and looking to the future. So the Abrahamic covenant, I believe, was the literal, eternal, and unconditional covenant. And so we see this balance actually in the prophetic writings between God sometimes referring to the Abrahamic covenant and other times talking about those prophetic curses that we've talked about several times. When the people are sent into exile, they should ask why, and the answer should be evident. That in Deuteronomy 28, he mentions all the blessings that would come from obedience, and he mentions all the cursings that will come from disobedience. And so what we have in Hosea is God saying something quite wonderful. And it shall be in that day, says the Lord, that you will call me husband and no longer call me master. For I shall take from her mouth the names of the Baals, and they shall be remembered by their name no more. God's looking to this day yet ahead. After the curses of the Mosaic covenant are enacted, God is saying, in the days ahead, I'm going to be committed to you based on the Abrahamic covenant. And so we should expect, if Hosea is truly going to be an example of the Lord, there's going to be a restoration. And indeed there is in chapter 3. Hosea redeems Gomer from prostitution. He does it by paying her debts, and he quarantines her from other men. And this is what we find in these 3 verses of chapter 3. It's quite a short chapter. In the first 3 verses, we see, then the Lord said to me, go and love your wife again. See, notice it doesn't say, go and remarry her because she's no longer your wife. Go and love your wife again, even though she commits adultery with another lover. This will illustrate that the Lord still loves Israel, even though the people have turned to other gods and love to worship them. And so Hosea's word is what I did. So I bought her back for 15 pieces of silver and 5 bushels of barley and a measure of wine. And then I said to her, you must live in my house for many days and stop your prostitution. During this time, you will not have sexual relations with anyone, not even with me. So here's what we've got. Gomer the harlot, how much is she worth? She was put up on the block, and she was sold to the highest bidder. I suspect Hosea would have paid less for her, unless it was needed, but he was seeing his naked wife up there in the block for sale. He was committed to pay whatever he needed to pay to make sure he got his wife back again, just like God. What did she cost? 15 shekels of silver plus a homer and a half of barley equals 1 unfaithful Gomer. Likewise, Israel the harlot also has to be restored to the God whom she has not been loyal to, because this God has been loyal to her. And here's the interpretation of this. This shows that Israel will go a long time without a king or a prince. Do you think they've gone a long time? 2,500 years so far. And without sacrifices. Israel's gone without sacrifices for 2.5 millennia. Without sacred pillars, priests, or even idols. Is it not true that Israel is not an idol worship? It is not an idol worshiping nation. You don't find altars of idols around Israel even to today. But after the people will return and devote themselves to the Lord their God and to David's descendant, their king. In the last days they will tremble in awe of the Lord and of his goodness. Wow. This is true chesed. Chesed is the key word for the book of Hosea, loyal. It's an interesting word because, well, he says in chapter 2:23, which I take as the key verse for the book, at that time I will plant a crop of Israelites and raise them for myself. I will show love on to those I called not loved. And to those I called not my people, I will say, now you are my people. And they will reply, you are our God. So what does Hesed really mean? If you look at the King James Version, you'll see that it is translated as loving kindness, which is pretty much an archaic word today. But the newer translations will say mercy or goodness. And that was actually the understood meaning of the word for many, many generations, many centuries. Until a man, an Old Testament scholar named Nelson Gluck, in 1927, did a really important study on the word. And he discovered that the word is actually used only in the covenant contexts. That chesed means covenant loyalty. It means I am making a promise and I am fulfilling that promise. Now, you can be loyal without covenant. We were loyal to people on the road driving over here today because we did not run over anybody on the road. But we didn't make any actual covenant with those people to care for them, protect them. But the covenant I made with my wife was definitely a covenant of loyalty. And so this covenant loyalty certainly does apply to marriage, as we see it applies to Hosea's marriage to Gomer and Israel's marriage, so to speak, to God. Think about the kind of covenant loyalty that Hosea had to show. His wife was not in the best of situations. She was abused. She was unfaithful. She was obviously had debt she had to pay, and he had to pay her out of debt. Others model God's type of loyalty to us, not only in marriage. We have some people who are willing to give their lives for their country. That's true covenant loyalty, promising to give up their various, even their life for their country. We often feel that God owes us something because he hasn't been loyal to us. But I think that's because we really haven't really thought about it. God owes us nothing. We owe everything to God. I mean, he gave you life itself, plus every good thing that you enjoy ultimately comes from him. And he's never once failed you. But God often shows his love to us through significant people. And I wonder, who has been the best example of loyalty in your life? Has it been your mother? Your father? Your spouse? Let that person's example exemplify God's loyalty to you, and let you be that kind of example of God's loyalty to others. We've seen in this first part of the book here that God motivates loyalty by examples. And we find here in the book of Hosea that God's loyalty to Israel was demonstrated first of all in a faithful Hosea to an unfaithful Gomer. But the marriage of Hosea, in terms of his personal marriage tragedy in the first 3 chapters, is actually only a picture of what we find in chapters 4 to 14, to the end of the book. Because unfaithful Gomer is actually depicting unfaithful Israel. Faithful Hosea is actually depicting the faithful Lord. And the marriage of Hosea is depicting the message of Hosea. It's a national message that is talked about in this book. So here's where we come when we address the latter part of the book. What we have here is that God motivates loyalty not only by examples, but by balancing correction and blessings. Okay, we will see this in chapters 4 to 14. God has the perfect balance between correction, that's the discipline aspect of God, and the blessing, the reward aspect that God gives in our lives. The Lord pairs his penalties with his gifts. And he's loyal to Israel both by discipline as well as by restoration. He punished Israel as he had punished in his covenant with Moses, as he promised. He punished Israel as he promised in his covenant with Moses. He said he would do it. If God didn't punish Israel when they went astray, he wouldn't have been fulfilling his promise. And so what we actually find when we get into chapter 4 in the first verse is a lawsuit declaration of God against Israel. It's as if you get into a court of law and you have the defendant there and the prosecutor, and the judge stands and he says, "This is why you are here. This person is accused of murdering so-and-so." The crime is stated up front. And then there's going to be evidences for and against that to make some kind of judgment. Okay, this is what we actually have here. This is lawsuit terminology that we find here at the beginning of chapter 4. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel. The Lord has brought charges against you, saying, and here's the three charges. There's no faithfulness. There's no kindness. Chesed, actually. And there's no knowledge of God in your land. So is that true? Is there really no knowledge of God? Chapters 4 to 6 are going to seek to prove that the people really don't know the Lord. They're married to him, so to speak, but they don't know him. It's like a spouse who has been married for many years and really doesn't know his or her husband or wife. Doesn't really know what their priorities are, values, or hurts. That's what Israel was like to God. When we see, he says they have no kindness, or they have no chesed, or loving loyalty. Well, God says, I'm going to prove that to you as well. Chapter 6:4 to 11:11 is going to say over and over, here are the different ways that you have not shown loving loyalty or kindness or chesed to me. And then, of course, God says there's no faithfulness in the land. And he has to prove that as well. You can't just make claims and then not support those claims. Especially God is going to be one who supports the claims that he makes. So we have the 3 accusations, but then we have God actually dealing with them in reverse order as we go through the book. So let's look at these briefly. He says, first of all, that there's no knowledge of God in the land. No knowledge. God will judge Israel and Judah for lack of spiritual knowledge, resulting in prostitution and idolatry, but he promises to accept them when they repent. Could it really be that God's people have no knowledge of him? Yes, indeed. He mentions in Hosea 4:2, he mentions four things here. He says there's only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. Sounds like more than four. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. He's actually referring to, and in these, four of them are actually talking about commandments. He's talking about the 9th commandment, you shall not lie. He's talking about the 6th commandment, do not murder. The 8th commandment, do not steal. And the 7th commandment, do not commit adultery. That would be a pretty clear way of telling the people, you really have no knowledge of God. You don't even follow the 10 commandments, let alone all the other things in the law. And we find in chapter 5 more of like a psychological spiral downward. And for example, he says their pride will not permit them to return to the Lord. They know they need to return to the Lord, but there's just no lack of there's no humility there. There's just too much pride. And so when they seek the Lord, they will not find him. Because they're really not seeking him. They have pride filling their hearts. So it's not truly a real, genuine repentance. And God said that they would go back, he would go back to his place until they admit their guilt. So here's this lack of knowledge that God's talking about. And in chapter 6, we see Israel went after other lovers instead of knowing her true husband, the Lord. They were eager to have idolatry of just about any type. Just like a prostitute waiting in a hallway for anyone who will come and pay her for her services. And so God says to them, come. Come to me. And he's actually speaking from Hosea's standpoint, where Hosea says, come, let us return to the Lord. He's torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He's injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. Isn't that interesting? The one who enacted the discipline is also the nurse. He's the doctor, the one who will heal them. They're one and the same. Because everything broken can be replaced, God says. He encourages the nation to repent because God is truly willing to accept them back. And in this chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, we see an eschatological significance here because this is one of several promises of restoration to the nation. God will never completely and finally destroy his people. This is the key reason we have Israel with us today. A remnant will remain rescued from exile, and this passage is not limited to the Old Testament. The restoration finds a partial fulfillment in the New Testament. I mean, you go to the New Testament, look how many Jews are still left. Jesus himself was a Jew, and the Jewish nation, although under the Roman oppression, was still a vibrant nation. In essence, it is an invitation to reacceptance by God of a people. And note that the language here is plural and corporate, not singular and individual. So he's saying Gomer's restoration is representative of Israel in the days ahead. It's truly going to be restored to the Lord. So the no knowledge of God is definitely proved. The no chesed, or the no kindness of God, is highlighted as we get into, let's say, chapter 7, where he talks about baldness being exposed and baking bread in an oven, and he has all these various images of before balding sets in. There's a bird-brained sense and bows bent. There's all kinds of bees, you might say, here. All these images in chapter 7 of there being a target, and they certainly don't hit the bullseye, but they don't even hit the target in terms of being characterized by loving loyalty, chesed, to the Lord. Christians today do the same as well. We claim the name of Jesus too often, but we commit spiritual adultery. We compromise with atheists, and we live as if our lives are really no different from atheists. At least the atheists are consistent. They say there's no real standard by which they need to live. For us Christians, oftentimes we say, yes, there's a standard, but we're hypocritical because we don't really live by that standard. God describes in chapter 8 the dispersion that's coming upon them for forsaking loving loyalty and instead having idolatrous worship and also alliances with those who were not following the Lord, and that would justify his impending judgment. It continues on in chapters 9, chapters 10. Luxuriant vine, a trained heifer, and a loved son, to illustrate the nation's idolatry and their wickedness instead of loving loyalty. He says in chapter 10, verse 1, how prosperous is the vine, loaded with fruit. But the richer the people get, the more pagan altars they build, the more bountiful. Is it not like godless believers today? Is it not like those who God prospers their lives so they can truly more houses, more cars, fatter bank accounts, instead of really being used of God because they're blessed of God? They need to be used of God in the lives of others. It's kind of some have said that the poor smile more than the rich. I think there's some truth to that. When we get to Hosea 11, God compares despite his idolatry and murder. Because Israel's like that. And we actually have a case study here of Hosea 11:1 that's actually mentioned in Matthew 2, verse 15, where Matthew says, Hosea talks about Israel being brought out of Egypt up to the land of Israel. So Jesus was brought out of Egypt up to back to Israel. And Matthew calls Jesus God's son, but he's an obedient son. So unlike Israel, Jesus was perfect in every instance where Israel failed. But they both came out of Egypt in that sense. So what we've seen in God, there was no kindness or chesed for God, loving loyalty for God. And now when we get to chapter 11 to 12 and 13, God's point is there's no faithfulness. And this is shown in their pride and their... it looks back to Jacob seeking God as he did at Bethel. He says, but they're not realness to the covenant, seen in its false worship throughout history, will result in coming destruction. The people of Samaria must bear the consequences of their... That was true of the capital city of the northern kingdom, Samaria, which is the focus, of course, of the book of final chapter, that he will bless Israel as he promised in his covenant with Abraham. What we need to see, though, is that the nations, and God promises when they do that, he will heal Israel's apostasy and make the nation fruitful again, and singing to idols. And so the wise and the righteous who understand this prophecy must obey the words of the Lord. And that's basically what we see in this chapter. Brand new. How God balances discipline with blessings. He disciplines us like a loving father. It hurts God to discipline us. We see this children, so the Lord disciplines those he loves. But that discipline is not because God's angry and he's vengeful the nation. And so as a loving father disciplines and then restores, so God does the same for us. And there's this perfect balance with the Lord that we lack. This perfect balance between discipline and blessings. We're too strict, or we are too rewarding, and therefore it doesn't work. Book. It's none other than his own loyalty first. I would say it's loyal to you, so be loyal to him. Simply put, the book enumerates time in Israel and how faithless the people had been. And the exhortation is simply be loyal by him first being loyal to us. And so he motivates us really by two loyalty. The best you'll find in the Bible, I think, in terms of God's loving loyalty. And then God motivates loyalty in his eyes. And so, how are you doing? How are you doing being depicted in the New Testament by the woman who would break the alabaster jar at Jesus' feet and anoint her loyalty, to use a year's worth of salary to show loving loyalty to the Lord? Brothers, love, like Jesus says to the church of Ephesus in Revelation 2:4, I hold this against you. Do you have that same love you had with Jesus when you first met him? When you first loved him then? Do not love the world or anything in the world, John. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. James referred to such people, whom he called believers in the book of James, hatred toward God. Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. And so here we have God has been loyal to you. Are you returning that loyalty?